Well, you watching our special broadcast here on WION with Jasper, Reid and me, Neha, Khanna. We're talking about India's economic survey and the expectations from tomorrow's all-important budget. And we still have with us our panel of economists to take us through what can be expected from tomorrow's budget and what the Indian and global economies currently look like. Guido Cosi, if I could begin this segment with you. Now, world bodies like the IMF seem to be rather bearish on the global economy. They are saying that global growth is projected to fall from 3.4% to 2.9%. But they're bullish on India, saying that we are likely to grow at a rate of anywhere between 6 to 6.8%. They also say that India and China will together account for about 50% of the global growth in 2023. Now, how do you reconcile these projections with the fact that we actually may have a recession coming, as was pointed out by Daniel in the last segment? It's not as if countries like India and China are going to be immune from this recession. What's your take?
Well, the big difference between the countries such as the United States or the European countries and India and China is that the previous countries are more mature, but this means that their growth rate is necessarily lower than countries that are in the process of increasing their per capita GDP. Because what we call the marginal product of capital is much higher in India and in China than in Europe and in the United States. So it is inevitable that these two countries grow more, no matter what happens in the business cycle. So the long-term tendency is inevitably in favor of India vis-a-vis Europe, for example. Also, population is much younger in India, and also it was already mentioned, India is resilient also because it is less dependent from foreign trade than other countries. Okay, India was often blamed for not opening trade enough, but in a period in which the rest of the world has high uncertainty and possibly a recession, that could be an advantage. So I think also that India's performance on the inflation front was good and much better, for example, than the United States or the Eurozone. So this implied that the Reserve Bank of India didn't need interest rates
let me cut in there and bring Sharmila into this. Sharmila, you're both a long-term India and a long-term China watcher. How do you compare the two economies at the moment and their prospects? Can you compare them? Is it a case of China plus one? Where do you stand on that?
Obviously, you can't compare China and India directly because that would be like comparing apples and oranges. But where you can compare them is in terms of their growth outlook for this year. But the drivers of the growth outlook between the two countries are very different. China, the growth outlook is very much being driven by the reopening boom, right? With the Xi government abandoning their zero COVID policy. So it's, revenge spending. You tie that together with the fiscal support to companies, as well as the government infrastructure spending, plus the easing of monetary policy. So the China story this year is very much about a China reopening story, boom, right? India, also the outlook is positive, and India's outlook is positive because it will be affected by, of course, a global recession, as will China. But the difference is that India is much less dependent on global trade, right? Because it is mostly a domestic, demand-driven economy. And, its growth is going to slow, but it's got that relative resilienceness, which we've just discussed previously in the first section of the interview.
Yeah, OK. And Sharmila, just staying on China, to what extent do you see China dwelling or reviewing the Indian economy? Are they becoming more interested in the Indian economy? How do you see that?
I don't know whether about if China's getting more interested in the India economy, but India's getting less interested in the China economy, as you've seen with the move from the Indian government to restrict Chinese investment in certain sectors, and India seems to be very much siding with US and its allies in this, let's say, China-US war, right? And part of it is India very much looking after its own interests in that it wants to attract the FDI and the US tech companies, the European tech companies into India, because the Modi government has made that whole digitalization, the growth of the manufacturing sector led by electronics very much central to where they want to take India in its Industrial Revolution 4.0.
All right, an interesting perspective there. Jasper, you know, tomorrow is the big day. The budget is going to be presented by this government. And since we have a panel of India watchers with us on the show, I think I'd like to go around the table and ask each of our panelists what their personal wish list is as far as this budget is concerned. So, Daniel, if I could begin with you. The expectations, no doubt, are very, very high from this budget. Most of us Indians would want to pay lesser taxes. But jokes apart, you know, Jayant Krishna talked about how this may be the last chance for the Modi government before the 2024 elections to introduce big ticket reforms. He wants to see greater investments, tax rationalization, changes to the GST structure. It's a long list. What is your wish list as far as this budget is concerned?
Well, I would personally like to see an investment in infrastructure. In order for India to stay on this path that we're talking about of really economic growth and prosperity, even though it may be down as we're talking about, it's still doing much better than the rest of the world. I think one of the key components is that investment into infrastructure. Physical infrastructure as well as technological infrastructure. The entire world is moving at a pace to go in that direction. This is an opportunity for India to be on that way, in that path where everyone needs to look to India in order to achieve their objectives related to technology. So if I had that one thing to say, I would say focus in on the infrastructure.
Jayant, what's your view? What are you looking for?
I would like a budget to announce some measures, which help the manufacturing sector. I mean, if you look at, India today is largely a service sector driven economy, not the manufacturing sector driven. As a matter of fact, our manufacturing share in GDP has fallen from almost 16% of the GDP in 2015 to a current level of about 14%, So I think there has to be, and fundamentally, I mean, government has reacted during COVID. They came up with the production linked incentives, which has resulted into some investments. But mind you, those are all capital intensive investments, which have a huge degree of automation. They have not created as many jobs as the government would have wanted PLI schemes to create, So I fundamentally believe that government has to focus on the labor intensive industry. Some of the examples could be apparel manufacturing, it could be leather sector. And even more important than that, I think the budget has to herald a signal that it is serious about research and development, about science and technology. That's very important. I mean, India is one of the lowest spenders.
Let me cut in there. That's a good list as it is. Guido, Jayant talked a bit about employment, right? And you mentioned that before, the low levels of female participation in the workforce. What are you looking for in the budget tomorrow on that front or any other front?
On that front, I would expect education and active labor market policies, especially favoring the women. But in a general way, in the budget in general, I would appreciate some attention to fiscal discipline, because it is easy in the last 1.5, 2 years before election for a government to boost demand at all costs, to try to increase public spending and reduce taxation. But this is not leaving a good gift to the young, because because if government debt keeps increasing, then the young will have to pay for it. It's not, So this is something, it would be nice to see expansion, but targeted to, as you said, but in a disciplined and careful way, looking also at the future generations.
All right. Certainly, the youth has high expectations from this budget. And remember, job generation is a very big concern for a very large section of our population. Sharmila Velan, let me come to you now. Your big expectations from tomorrow's budget. A point was made earlier about how India continues to be a service sector driven economy, not a manufacturing hub, unlike, let's say, China. Do you see that changing anytime soon? What would you like to see in tomorrow's budget? And also, if I could very quickly put you on the spot and ask you, how would you rate the economic performance of the Modi government over the last few years? Because this is a government that came in with a brute majority and on the promise of some big bang reforms.
All right, Neha, two very good questions. Let me deal with the first one in terms of budgetary expectation. My overriding expectation is that the government continues with fiscal consolidation, which they've already indicated that a gentle glide, because with a deficit running, estimated deficit running at 6.4% and a current account deficit running at close to 5% of GDP, they can't afford to do anything because otherwise, right? Because that raises the risk of inviting a crisis in a time when the world is in recession and investors are tetchy. I would like to continue to see the focus that we've seen in the last two budgets, where the shift in spending has moved from current consumption to capital and infrastructure spending. And that I would expect to continue to see in this upcoming budget, but I think I expect some moderation on capital spending, simply because last year or the fiscal year that we are currently in, capital expenditure by the government has increased by 60%, right, against a long-term average of about 30%. So that base cannot be continue, especially if tax revenue growth slow with the economy slowing. But I would like the focus still to be very much that. Now, I also acknowledge that not only does the Modi government face elections next year, there's 10 very important states going to election this year, including Rajasthan, Karnataka, and Madhya Pradesh. And therefore, there has to be some populist giving away, right? It's a given. What I would like is that A, it's limited, and B, it's well thought through, and it's more couched in terms of spending on health, education, innovation, skills upgrade, and job creation, rather than fiscal handouts, which frankly India doesn't need, because as we talked about earlier, rural incomes are growing at a very healthy tick. Coming on to your second question, which I have completely forgotten. Sorry.
Let me repeat it for you. Marks out of 10 for the current regime's economic performance in the last two terms. Simple as that.
I would say 8 out of 10.
Daniel, what are you saying? What are you saying from New Jersey?
That's what I was exactly going to say. I'll actually do an 8.5 out of 10. I think they've done a really, really good job, particularly compared to other nations.
Okay, and Giant...
Well, if Daniel's at 8.5, I might have to go to 9. They have done a very good job. I might not agree with their religious views of Kashmir, but they've done a very good job on the technocratic management of the economy.
It's like a bitted up evening. Brian, just Giant, turning to you here. If you're an opposition party, whether that's the Congress Party or other opposition parties, how are you seeing this? Are you quaking in your boots?
Sorry, seeing what?
How are you seeing this economic survey? It's a very, very bullish document, right? It's written by people who are talking their own game. But if you're the Congress Party and you're looking at this litany of extraordinary economic metrics, what are you thinking?
So I frankly, if you look at India's economic history in the last couple of decades, very often the budget announcements are not in sync with directionally what the economic survey says. So I won't. So this is to me just a document, unless it is backed up with some bold announcements in the union budget tomorrow by the finance minister. So yes, it is a bullish document.
Giant, the question is if you're Rahul Gandhi, how are you seeing this document? Right, we've heard 8.5, 8.8 out of 10. That's an intimidating economic record. How is the opposition going to counter this?
So if I have to act like an opposition leader, I would reject the the survey even before it was announced. That's how most of the opposition parties do.
So too good to be true. Too good to be true. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Guido, what are you saying on this? You're a long-term India watcher. Are you impressed with the economic performance of the last 2 terms?
Well, I was impressed. I must say. It was quite good. They also resisted. India resisted to COVID, to a very, very nasty COVID attack, and also the vaccination campaign was extremely successful. It was nice to see a knowledge transfer from the West. In fact, Serum Institute of India, for example, managed to have a great license and to vaccinate India and save it. So I think it is really a stunning performance, much better than China, that, for example, relied on their inactivated virus vaccines and couldn't get out of COVID so easily. So on top of that, of course, there was entrepreneurship, there was foreign direct investment, so things improved. I would stress the need now to focus more on the longer term, but for the short and medium term, my opinion is very positive.
Yeah, and we should. That's interesting, Guido, and we should Neha recognise. It's a little under 2 years ago that the extraordinary, devastating second wave of COVID came through India. And for those of us that were here, actually announcing today that there's been a full recovery of that is a very good day, whichever side of the political divide you're on, right?
That's quite correct, actually. And, of course, India's vaccination program has been lauded globally, and in fact the economic survey, amongst other things, also says that India has done rather well to recover from the devastating impact of the COVID pandemic, something that not every economy can boast of.
Yeah, very true, very true. And Sharmila, we're in the kind of final straight now. But we've talked a bit about demographics, and demographics is destiny. There's a lot of young people in this country. Sharmila, when you're thinking about the young of this country, are you very optimistic for their future in terms of skills? The world's changing in all sorts of ways, AI, big data, etc. How well do you feel India's poised on that front, particularly for the young?
Well, given the number of engineers, tech people that India produces, it's impressive in terms of absolute numbers. Okay, percentage of population, less so. But, you take that and the whole thing of, in decades that we've seen the whole back office moving to India, it certainly has the potential to move to the next level with AI, data sciences, etc. But it depends on a couple of things. One is government policy in terms of liberalizing, deregulating, getting foreigners into India and making it attractive from a tax incentive point of view, in terms of access and improving ease of doing business. And this is not only foreign companies, but also Indian companies. And they've made a lot of headway. It's about continuing in that direction and being focused on the new generation industries. And second is, whether the technology transfer happens and it creates the opportunities for actual employment.
Absolutely.
Okay, so that's pretty positive stuff. Daniel, just staying on this attractiveness of India to foreign business. You read the economic survey today, it looks a very attractive place. But what's your sense in real terms of how attractive India is to foreign investors or to foreign entrepreneurs? Because there has been prejudice in the past.
Well, I think prejudice exists everywhere, so I don't think that's unique per se to India. But what I will say, which I think is an advantage for India, I think that there is a real mistrust when it comes to entrepreneurs and even governments in dealing with China, specifically related to the theft of intellectual property. I mean, that is really one of the concerns that businesses around the world have in investing in China. Conversely, I don't hear any of those discussions or hesitation in investing in India, because I do think that the country and the businesses are viewed as trustworthy. And I think with the labor shortage in many different areas, at least in the United States, there is an awful lot of outsourcing that's going on to India. So I believe that, prejudice aside, India will continue to do very, very well there.
All right, outsourcing clearly has worked to India's advantage over the years. But Jayant Krishna, I want to ask you these two important questions that have been raised by my colleague Jasper. It's about India's youth and it's about investment. Number one, how do we ensure that we can actually cash in on our demographic dividend and not let it turn into a demographic disaster? Number one. Number two, how are we doing, honestly speaking, on the investment front, both domestically and foreign investment?
Yeah, so I'll focus on the first question because that's extremely important. See, the government of India came out in the year 2020 with a new education policy, where they talked about going forward. Government typically spends, both the federal government and state governments put together spend about 3% of their GDP on education. That going up to 6%. On research and development, they said a national research foundation would be set up, which will have almost 50,000 crore worth of outlay spread over 5 years. So I think now the time has come. The government has to signal some increase in the education spend levels, skill development spend levels. That's very, very important, because the new education policy cannot fully see the light of the day unless the spend on education goes up. That's fundamentally very, very important. Other thing, for a demographic dividend that you spoke about, I think it's very important that India should embrace transnational standards for skill development. It can't just be happy with the standards of skilling which exist in India. It has to have global responses in terms of embracing the transnational standards and people getting trained on that. I fundamentally believe if today Indian tech industry, I'm talking about the software services, it accounts for almost 45 to 50% of the addressable, outsourceable, right. Business all over the world. Mm-hmm. Why can't it happen in other sectors also? Why is it that in the top 20 tech companies in the US, more than half of them have not just the Googles and Microsoft, more than half of them have Indian CEOs. So we really have to start looking at, what makes our talent thrive.
So why should outsourcing be confined just to the tech sector? Though, of course, the meltdown that we've seen in the tech sector in recent days is a different story altogether that we can probably discuss on another occasion, Jasper.
Yes, there's no end to the topics we can discuss here, and certainly a very big day tomorrow. It'd be very interesting to see whether the forecasts of the panellists play out tomorrow with the Finance Minister.
Absolutely. On that note, we'd like to thank all our guests for joining us on this special hour-long broadcast to share their perspectives with us on India's economic growth outlook. Tomorrow, as Jasper said, is the big day when the budget is going to be presented. Are the expectations going to be fulfilled? Remember, we're a billion-plus people. The expectations are sky high. Can the government live up to those expectations? That remains the big question. But do remember to tune in to WION tomorrow as we bring you a complete lowdown on that very important budget. Jasper.
Yes, absolutely. And you never know. I mean, they're signalling steady as she goes, but perhaps some big surprises tomorrow, and maybe a few political stops. Who knows?
Maybe some stops. Like I said, we all want to pay lower taxes, Jasper. So that would be quite a bonus. Is this going to be a bold budget or a populist one? We will find out only tomorrow. But on that note, thank you so much for joining us on the show. It's goodbye from Jasper and me.